Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's hard to step away from a busy day, and we appreciate you taking the time to tune in for this webinar. My name is Darren McPhee. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Blue Cat, and with me today, I have two senior members from our Solution Engagement team. First, I would like to introduce our Managing Architect, Chris Buxton. Chris has been working with DNS for 21 years, and he's also been migrating customers from one solution to another for over 16 years. And the past 7.5 of those years has been with Blue Cat. We are also joined by migration architect Reese, who's been in the industry for over 23 years and has been migrating customers to Blue Cat since 2013. They're both going to be talking to us about Blue Cat migration methodology and also share some firsthand experience with customers they've migrated. So it should be a really interesting discussion. We're also going to talk about some of the concerns and common questions that someone may have when considering migrating to a new solution. Now, we've put aside plenty of time at the end of the hour for Chris and Reese to also answer any of your questions. So I'd encourage you to please make sure you use the Q&A button if you have anything to ask as the webinar is going on. It's in the little black bar at the top left corner of your webinar window. Also, during the webinar, if you're having any issues with the Q&A, just use the chat feature to let me know, and we'll make sure that they get your questions. I just want to note that we'll also be sharing a recorded version of this session over email afterwards. So if anyone has to leave a little early or you want to rewatch it, we'll be sending you a link as a follow-up. Now, I see some more people have logged on. So for those of you just joining us, welcome. We're ready to get going. And I'd like to start things off with Chris. So Chris, I did a little bit of an introduction for you, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Sure. I've been at Blue Cat, like you said, since 2010, and I've worked on more migrations than I can even remember. But certainly several big ones. I've been migrating customers both at Blue Cat and at my previous employer to Blue Cat and my previous employer's DNS solutions, including Kaiser Permanente and Zurich Insurance and Hewlett Packard and Apple Computer and Intuit and several others. So I've been doing DNS since 21 years, since I worked at starting at a small ISP. And I've just grown my knowledge and expertise since then.
Excellent. So you're the managing architect in the solutions team, and we're here to really talk about the migration methodology of Blue Cat. Could you do a little bit of a summary of that, the general approach we take with customers, our migration philosophy, the tools we use, just kind of a thumbnail sketch of that?
Sure. The first thing that we always consider is we approach a migration with an eye toward migrating as faithfully and correctly as possible. We don't want to just pick up data and flip it around and slam it down into the new solution and call it a day. So we start by analyzing the architecture and the data to make sure that what we're putting in place is the best possible solution. Once we have that identified, we'll stand up the infrastructure, whether that's hardware or virtual machines, and then we'll go through a dry run, possibly several, and make sure that the customer is satisfied not only with the service that we're standing up and the architecture that we've proposed and built, but also the data as migrated. And once we have that nailed down, the next step is just to start moving data into production quality service and start moving end users over to the new service. So we'll do one or possibly several maintenance windows to cut over services to Blue Cat.
Now, as you're going through this, and I think in the discussions you had before, but even during, I'm sure you know a lot of the common concerns a customer might have even beforehand when they're considering the migration. Can you maybe run through what some of those common concerns are and how the team tries to mitigate those when they're planning?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the first and most basic concern is, will the new solution do everything that the old solution did? in terms of providing services to end users. And that's just for the table stakes for any player in our industry. Once we've gotten through that, it's a question of comparing the old solution to the new solution. How similar are the two solutions? Will the new solution, will Blue Cat require the customer to change their processes? The biggest difference we see for QIP in particular is DHCP option templates, a feature of QIP. And while we don't have exactly the same feature, we have similar features, but we also have an inheritance model where options can be set higher up in the hierarchy and inherit down to all the networks in a site, for example, or all the networks in the entire enterprise. And different options can be set at different levels. And so once customers see that how the inheritance model works, they usually don't feel they need the QIP option template feature. And the other question is, given that there is a different user interface and there will be some changes to process from that, the next question from a lot of, especially our larger customers, is how much can they leverage our API to integrate with other systems like ServiceNow or what have you, so that they don't have to retrain their users. They can just continue using the interfaces they've been accustomed to, and it just manages Blue Cat in the back end.
Excellent. Now, you've had experience with a large number of customers. You went through that at the beginning when you introduced yourself, and we covered some of it as well. A lot of big customer migrations, various size companies, various industries, and I'm sure with some really unique challenges. Can you give us maybe a few examples of some of those customer migration stories and the things that you've worked on?
Absolutely. So when I joined Blue Cat in 2010, the project for Kaiser Permanente was already 4 months underway, and they were struggling to, the project team and the customer were struggling to figure out how to do this. This was the first time Blue Cat had ever done a phased migration, and keep in mind this is 7.5 years ago. So we had to develop the tool set and the methodology to divide up a migration into phases, and we ended up with 18 phases in that project. And it was the first time, therefore, that we had to build a sort of a DNS resolution framework so that end users could resolve names, whether they were migrated to Blue Cat or still in the old system. And so that was a big learning experience for Blue Cat. We developed a lot of our now standardized methods for that project. Another big one that I tackled was CSC, which is now part of AT&T, I believe. In 2012, we took on this project. This was my first QIP migration, and it was fairly large. It was a global enterprise, and it ended up being a 6-phase migration because of the way they had architected their systems internally. It was a huge project. There were endless problems with the customer environment, with firewalls and routing issues. In particular, we found that the checkpoint firewalls, the most popular enterprise firewall in the world, as I understand it, by default were blocking large DNS packets. And so there were especially, this introduced extra latency for DNS queries, and that caused outages and problems I mean, not serious major outages, but there were hiccups that we had to overcome and identify as the firewall is blocking certain packets.
Today, obviously, we're talking about migration methodology and the process we use, and we're focusing in on Vital QIP, and a solution that the people that are joining know very well. Obviously, it's also a solution that we as a company know very well. And in talking with you guys, I think everyone would agree that it's a good solution. It's got a strong feature set. And actually, similarities between Blue Cat and Vital QIP from an architecture perspective often make migrations much smoother. Can you talk a little bit more about that? You already mentioned, I think, earlier the inheritance model, which is a question that comes up, but there's other things as well that really help in terms of making that migration a little bit more seamless, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So the object model is remarkably similar. Good ideas come to multiple people. So QIP organizations map directly to Blue Cat configurations and so on. We have blocks and networks. They have the equivalent of blocks and networks. And so for the most part, the data migrates very cleanly. There's very similar, not just data model architecture, but also a very similar way that we deploy the solution. There are a few differences. For example, we provide both the software and the platform that it runs on, whereas a lot of QIP customers will leverage a different platform, either from Microsoft or from formerly Sun or Linux, or they'll take the N3K Run IP devices. Now, Run IP in particular, which is very popular for QIP customers, provides an HA solution, and so do we. But our HA solution is a little more integrated with our software because we own both. So we have a little bit of a difference there. We have a world-class team to migrate data from one product to the other. And so we have people who've seen QIP both as a customer and as an engineer at QIP that have moved over to Blue Cat, and of course, in general in our migrations. So, for example, we have one gentleman on the team who's been doing DNS for 30 years, since the DNS specification was still being ironed out in 1987. We have someone who has been doing DNS for 22 years, starting in telecoms, and is now one of our migration architects. And we have Reese, of course, who's on the phone. He'll be introducing himself in a few minutes, I think. So I think that was all the points I had to cover on that one.
Excellent. Yeah, we're going to move to Reese now because he's going to give us some experiences he's had on some major customer projects. Before we introduce Reese, I just want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions as we're going to reserve a good amount of time at the end. So if there's anything you think of as we're going through, just use the Q&A button. If you have anything to ask, again, it's the little black bar at the top left corner of your webinar window. So Reese, let's go through a couple of customer stories, but just before we do, in the same way that Chris gave a little bit more of his background, why don't you tell us a little bit more of yourself as well?
Oh, sure. Well, good day, everybody. We'll skip the good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I never know what time zone everybody's in. It's still morning for me. I've been working with Blue Cat for a little over 4 years now. I've actually been involved in the DDI space for about 23 years. I started back in 1994 when I put QIP into a bank on the East Coast. It was Nations Bank at the time. It's now grown into Bank of America. But I installed and configured and managed QIP for Nations Bank for quite a while. In my 4 years at Blue Cat, I have totally lost count of the number of migrations that I've done. It's somewhere above 70. Some of them have been 1 to 2 day, little quick jobs. Some of them have been 6 months, a year to, completely finish the entire project.
Excellent. So you've worked on a number of major customer migrations. You just went through a few in your background. You spent a lot of time, in particular, at Blue Cat with customers who've moved from Vital QIP. And you're kind of recognized in-house as one of our QIP experts from a migration perspective. So we wanted to spend some time talking about a couple of those customer experiences. The first one that we wanted to talk about was TJX. Can you give us a summary of the project scope of that migration project you worked on? Oh,
you bet. TJX was a pretty large undertaking of a project. They had about 81 or 82 dual purpose QIP DNS DHCP servers. They came to Blue Cat looking for a reliable solution, something that would replace their existing infrastructure that with more security, et cetera, so on. They had had some security breaches in the past. They were experiencing various and sundry problems with, dynamic DNS. We replaced their entire infrastructure with roughly about 50 Blue Cat servers, 42 of those being dual purpose DNS DHCP. There was a whole nother layer that we put in to just kind of augment a lot of the load on those DHCP servers so that they're not having to do so much DNS. So we put in basically a full authoritative layer that everything forwarded to and then recursed out to the internet if necessary. We got them done in approximately 6 months in a multi-phase project. We started in January with their DNS, which we did in we like to call it a big bang approach. So DNS was just cut over one day. All of a sudden, bam, they're on Blue Cat. We ran into a couple of challenges with that. We'll get into those here in just a few minutes. DHCP, we finished them off in about 9 to 10 phases. We originally scheduled 7 due to some various customer reasons. We had to add a couple of more just because of business units that weren't ready to convert whenever the TJX management said, okay, we need to do this section now, this section now. Some business units would push back. It never fails with the customer. There's going to be, miscellaneous and sundry issues. But to be perfectly honest with that one, the budgeted hours that TJX had bought from Blue Cat to start with, we finished them under budgeted hours. And they were insanely happy with what they got from us.
Excellent. I know you mentioned, there were project goals, and they obviously security was very important. This is obviously a major retailer. Did they have other particular concerns that you had to take into account as you were scoping out this project and planning things with them?
Oh, absolutely. Just the number of stores that are involved in the TJX network. They were very concerned about any downtime for the stores. We were able to mitigate all of that downtime down to, less than 2 minutes for DNS services and less than 5 minutes for DHCP services. DNS is pretty resilient. The way we put it in there, the only downtime on any of the DNS servers was literally replacing a server on the same address as a legacy QIP server. The DHCP, it's a little bit more touchy because you've got new clients coming online, et cetera, so on. And, you've got a single DHCP server potentially serving, hundreds of clients. So we were able to mitigate that down to less than about 5 minutes.
That's excellent.
They also, let me just throw one more in there. They also had some QIP licensing and support contracts that were in the process of expiring very soon. So they needed to get this done as quickly as possible just to mitigate any problems with QIP servers and potentially not having the support they needed.
So a very clear time crunch, and you didn't have any flexibility to extend or change.
Pretty much none, correct.
So now that's definitely a challenge you faced. I'm sure there were other things that you came across once you started the project. So were there other interesting things you'd want to bring up in terms of challenges, and just kind of give us a feel for how those were addressed during the project?
Well, one of the most interesting ones was TJX uses a SCCM platform to manage all of their remote users and in-house desktops and laptops, et cetera, for software updates, et cetera, so on. And that product tends to rely heavily on dynamic DNS. One of the problems we've seen in the past is QIP uses one flavor that is kind of their own way of doing dynamic DNS. BlueCat, we use an ISC standard way of doing dynamic DNS, and the two don't tend to talk to each other. So since we could not move all the DHCP servers, you know, we're talking 70 some odd DHCP servers at one single instance, we were looking at the potential for not having dynamic DNS, and one of our engineers in-house with BlueCat actually came over from Alcatel-Lucent and was a product manager at for QIP. We sat down and worked with him for a little while and came up with a way to make dynamic DNS work between QIP and BlueCat. So we were able to totally eliminate any problems with their SCCM software and, you know, dynamic DNS and all of those clients getting their proper software updates. You know, there's various other issues where, you know, the customer, a lot of times they, you know, just because of attrition in, you know, the teams, et cetera, so on, people leaving, people coming in, some of the knowledge of their network just gets lost in the process. So, you know, we end up having to go through, do a full analysis of everything, and then we'll find, you know, miscellaneous and sundry problems that they didn't even realize existed, or something that they may not even known was there. Data integrity is always another one, you know, going through and cleaning up a lot of the stale DNS entries that QIP unfortunately leaves out there. And just from the option templates, a lot of the stale data that's left in the database that might be presented to us when they give us the data to convert, we have to look at it and go, you know, is this still in use? Is this not in use? You know, can we get rid of it? In some cases, we might get rid of something and then go to do bring a customer online with BlueCat and come to find out, oh, wait a minute, we were using this option or this particular set of features, and we have to work around that and figure out a way to keep that functioning.
And on the data integrity side, that's not an issue exclusive from a QIP perspective. It's something we encounter with
absolutely. Yeah, we see that with a lot of migrations from various projects, Microsoft InfoLog, just about everything. There's a lot of miscellaneous cleanup that needs to be done just because of things that get left over.
Right. Chris, we have the ability to show a potential interested customer some of our migration process through the idea of a migration test drive, if you will. Could you expand a little bit on that, how it works, what the process is, what it would actually show an interested party?
Yeah, of course. So it starts with a with a discussion with one of our experts from our solution engagement team, where we discuss you know, how extensively QIP is installed in the environment and whether there's other solutions in the environment. And then we ask for a backup from QIP of all the QIP data. And this just has the database backup file. So it doesn't have all the service level configuration. It doesn't have quite everything that we need to do a full migration, but it'll be good enough to get an idea of what the migrated data will look like and how it will look in BlueCat. Once we get that backup archive from QIP, we have tools to process that and import it into the BlueCat Address Manager. And at that point, we can show the customer you know, their particular staged BlueCat Address Manager with their data ready to be deployed to a DNS or DHCP server, although obviously in our lab, not in their production environment. So if you want to know more about that, of course, you can just talk to your BlueCat account manager.
Excellent. So with that, I want to move to the Q&A section. So we have a couple of questions here. I'll read them out, and Chris and Reese, we can handle them one by one. So first question is, another question we've got is, how long is the outage? And I think Reese covered a little bit of this in his TJX example. I think that they had a goal of they wanted downtime of about 2 minutes for DNS, if I'm correct. But is that something again that is comes from the customer and something that we support based on what their goals are, or do you typically have a defined time frame for that?
That's a great question. We try to minimize downtime as much as possible. We understand that when a customer gives us, let's say, a 4 or 6 or 8 hour maintenance window, that doesn't mean we can be down for 4 or 6 or 8 hours. Services still need to be as functional as much as possible. So in a typical engagement, each outage, when there is an outage, will be less than 2 minutes if at all possible. I've had customers mandate a 30-second outage maximum, and we've hit that goal. For a lot of our DNS cutovers, the outage window can be minimized to 0, where the old solution is still answering queries even as the new solution is being stood up and validated, and then the old solution simply has its data dropped but forwarded into BlueCat, and so there's 0 outage whatsoever.
Excellent. Here's a question that I'm sure you get asked quite a bit. So what best practices do you follow to help ensure the most seamless and painless migration?
Right. So the first thing we do is we take a special care with the customer's data. We want to make sure that we're migrating good data. So if we have, as Reese was alluding to earlier, if we have legacy systems that are littered with bad data, with stale data, we want to make sure that we work with the customer to identify that and clean it out before we bring it into the BlueCat Address Manager. Right. Beyond that, it's about collaboration and planning and testing and validation. We validate every step of the way when we're doing anything that affects production. We make sure the customer is comfortable at every point with what we're doing.
Excellent. Just got another question on the screen. During the migration period, when there are 2 separate systems, for example, BlueCat and QIP, how is normal daily change management handled?
That's a great question, and the answer depends on each customer. What we've seen in the past is, for one, we try to minimize how long that overlap is so that there's as little of that as possible. 2, we make sure that the end users train to use BlueCat so that they know what they're doing. Not end users, but the end admins, or know what they're doing when they need to make a change in BlueCat. But in terms of entering data into one system or the other, either it can be done just by tribal knowledge of people knowing, oh yeah, this data has been migrated, and so we need to make the changes in BlueCat, and that data is still in QIP, or we'll set up some kind of integration platform where either ServiceNow or we have our own integration tool. The customer has a single interface to make changes, and that system will then communicate those changes to QIP, to BlueCat, or to both as needed.
Darren, if this is Reese, if I can just throw in one specific example, just to kind of elaborate on what Chris was just saying. Let's go back to Nike, where we were doing, a few networks at a time. What we literally did was kept a list of networks migrated, networks not migrated, so that when one of their users called in with an issue, their help desk could look at this list and they would know exactly which system they needed to get into to verify what might be going on, find out what the problems might be. And then as networks were migrated over, we would just move that list from one side to the other.
Excellent.
Right. And so what we've done with the integration platform is exactly that, but with software making the decision. So we keep a list that we update with each maintenance window that tells the software which system to make changes to.
Okay. So one more question here, and I'm sure it's one that you guys get right from the beginning every single time. and it's probably, who do we call for support? And probably break that down by, during the project and also after. What's the support model from a Blue Cat perspective?
Right. So most of our QIP migrations involve our enterprise support team as well as our solution engagement team. And so they'll get involved right from the beginning so that they understand what we're doing and can support it as we go. But during a migration and immediately after, the architect who is overseeing the migration is available for support. And then typically after some period of time, after the system has settled in and been used for some period of time, we'll transition that part of the data or the whole solution to our enterprise support team.
Excellent. I think that is the last question. So just want to provide a few closing notes before we wrap up. I mentioned before, we're going to be sharing a recorded version of this session with you all, so keep an eye out for it in your inbox. I want to thank Chris and Reese again for taking the time to be here with us today. They both had a super busy day filled with customer calls and meetings, so we appreciate their time and their information that they shared. I also want to thank everyone for listening and asking your questions. Enjoy the rest of your week, everyone.